Discourse 4 of Brain Anatomy of Duality. We will be looking at the prefrontal cortex and examining inattention and impulsivity, the dogs that distract. Okay. Well, let's start with the functions of the prefrontal cortex. Well, first of all, the prefrontal cortex is the most evolved part of the brain. And you probably already know that. And if you didn't know that before, if you listen to previous sessions, especially in the fivefold brain system, discourse, then you know this very fact. It's at the front, hence the prefrontal cortex of the brain, and it is the executive brain. It's the supervisor. So what does it do? It controls attention span, perseverance, judgment, most importantly, impulse control, equally important, organization, self-monitoring, and as I said, supervision, problem solving, critical thinking, forward thinking, learning from experience. It allows us to have the ability to feel and express emotions. It governs interaction with the limbic system, and it allows us to feel empathy. So it occupies the first and front third of the brain, rather. It's underneath the forehead. Dr. Amen mentions that it's often divided into three sections. The dorsolateral section on the outside surface of the prefrontal cortex, the inferior orbital section on the front undersurface of the brain, and the cingulate gyrus, which runs through the middle of the frontal lobes. The cingulate gyrus, often considered to be part of the limbic brain, will be covered in another chapter that we'll be looking at. Well, together the dorsolateral and inferior orbital gyrus are often termed the executive control center, using the word that I chose to use a couple minutes ago. They will be discussed together. We'll touch on them, is what I'm saying. Now, to reiterate, the prefrontal cortex is the part of the brain that watches, supervises, guides, directs, and focuses your behavior. So again, this helps to govern, helps to keep in control and self-control, and helps us to supervise dogs of distraction, the dogs that are constantly outward focused, the part of ourselves, those sense desires that are all over the place, the seemingly unending stream of sensory input that we receive from the outside world. As an executive, it governs the abilities such as time management. It gives you the capacity to formulate goals, to make plans for their execution, to carry them out in an effective way, and to change course and improvise in the face of obstacles or failure, and to do so successfully in the absence of external direction or structure. It also helps with judgment, planning. Well, we mentioned that. Organization is a big one. I'm going to mention it again. And critical thinking. So now, keeping those in mind, I just wanted to mention that, I can relate to having these functions mature late or later, or these functions having been arrested in my development. Why? I don't know. It was because I had so many concussions when I played football in high school. I don't know that either. No brain abnormality was ever discovered within myself, but by any medical means or measuring. However, I did suffer some torment, and with some emotional issues, and sometimes emotional trauma and emotional pain can help to stunt the development of this. And so I think I had an overactive limbic system, which we've already talked about, and that had a lot to do with, I think, not allowing this executive function to fully come to the foray, or come to the front, so to speak, no pun intended, but it's developing nonetheless, because I'm becoming more objective. Even though I struggle with time management and attentional issues, I'm becoming better at focusing on projects and finishing them versus starting something new every 5 minutes and then just being scatterbrained and all over the place. I've always, one might ask, well, how did I get through school, and how did I get through college, and how did I get jobs and all those things if I had these things stunted? Well, first of all, I came to see these things as true after having taken psychology courses after I'd been out of college, and when I was working with kids. And you see that, to the most part, they're very impulsive before the frontal lobes develop. And, in rare cases, there's some whose frontal lobes develop a little earlier. And I worked with a few students like that as well. And it was kind of disgruntling to see these students excel, especially in the areas of critical thinking. For some reason, in high school and the college, I struggled with critical thinking. I compensated in other ways, and I excelled in other ways, and I did cope in ways that other senses and other learning styles, what some people would call multiple intelligence. I used multiple means to help learn and process information, but critical thinking was always difficult for me in high school. And then when I got to college, it wasn't any better. I had all this trapped emotional pain in my body, in my mind, and or my brain, and I didn't have healthy ways to release it. So I was ultimately, in becoming an actor, that I was able to release deep-seated angers, frustrations, not just frustrations, but deep-seated animosity, and I was able to express needs and things that I felt that I needed in order to needed to not acquire, but needed to embrace in order to become more whole and healed, and in that sense. And the critical thinking thing was very frustrating. How did I get through college? How did I get through high school? I wasn't anyone in special education or anything. I had a photographic memory, and this helped in theater, in acting, in films. So the ability to remember things that I saw and heard at the same time, and then used through, in my learning styles, the multiple means, the multiple ways, actually, the multiple modes of learning that I embraced really exploded and through creativity in college, and I felt like a little kid with some of the things I was doing. But I knew when I came to take psychology courses, developmental psychology, child psychology courses, and now even through this research. This research and research by Joseph Chilton Pierce and others in brain science and neuroanatomy and brain anatomy, in neurology, psychiatry, psychology. I've come to find out just how important the prefrontal lobes are. If anybody is familiar with that story of Phineas Gage, the railroad worker who had that tie or whatever it was, a big metal rod through an explosion go through his frontal lobe, damaging it. And when it was removed, he did live and survive miraculously, but his frontal lobes, prefrontal cortex rather, was forever damaged, and he wasn't able to regulate emotions. He was like an animal, a very vicious animal after that. So, now, the prefrontal cortex also helps you think about what you say or do before you say or do it. For example, if you are having a disagreement with your spouse, Eamon says, and when you do have good prefrontal cortex function, you're more likely to give a thoughtful response that helps the situation rather than exacerbates it. If you have poor PFC function, you're more likely to do or say something that'll make the situation worse or to escalate it further. So also, the prefrontal cortex helps you to problem solve. Yeah, I struggle with that too, but I'm improving. I'm improving, and I give that glory to the divinity of all that is for helping to rewire my brain, and part of that is we'll learn that you can learn better through certain exercises as well as meditation. You begin to use more parts of your brain. It might not totally work for people with traumatic brain injuries, but there still is untapped potential in everyone. Untapped potential in everyone. Now, people with poor prefrontal cortex functioning have the pattern behavior where they don't learn from their mistakes. So, on the flip side, good functioning in this area will help you learn from your mistakes and not repeat them. It helps you to focus on important information while filtering out less significant thoughts and sensations. It helps with attentional issues, as we mentioned before. It's required for short-term memory and learning. But the filtering out process is very important. And I'm struggling with that to this day. I don't know. I don't know what would happen if somebody scanned my brain. But I'm telling you, I understand what this doctor is saying. I understand it. But the good news is, you don't have to continue to live with the brain that you were born with or conditioned to have through social formation, as well as nurturing. Yes, as mentioned too, it helps you to feel and express emotions such as happiness, sadness, joy, and love. It's different from the more primitive limbic system, even though the limbic system controls moods and libido. The prefrontal cortex is able to translate the workings of the limbic system into recognizable feelings, emotions, and words such as love, passion, or hate. Amen says underactivity or damage in this part of the brain often leads to a decreased ability to express thoughts and feelings. Now, you can't confuse this with somebody who's just an introvert and is shy. The biggest thing, and you see it in teenagers if you've ever worked with them and younger kids, that this area of the brain is not fully developed, so therefore thoughtfulness and impulse control are not harnessed. So that's why you see these impulsive things happening in kids in childhood and adolescence. They don't have the ability to think through the consequences of their behavior. They just see what's in front of them. They are self-grasping. They just reach for things. They just do things. They hit someone. They steal from someone. They speak out. They do something to disrupt the classroom in school. You see people spending money frivolously, uncontrollably, when there's overactivity in the PFC. It's important to say that the PFC has many connections to the limbic system. What it does is it sends inhibitory messages that keep it under control. Like I said, that it regulates the emotions. It helps you, quote, what Eamon says, use your head along with your emotions, rather than allow your emotions to use you. In its damage, such as what happened with Phineas Gage, not just damage, but underactivity in this part of the brain, especially on the left side, says Eamon, that where and when the PFC cannot appropriately inhibit the limbic system, causing an increased vulnerability to depression if, in fact, the limbic system becomes overactive. Now, a classic example of this problem in the left side of the brain, in the prefrontal cortex, is those who have had a left frontal lobe stroke. And he said that 60% of patients with these strokes develop a major depression within about a period of 1 year. Now, he goes on to explain what scientists do with studies in neuroimaging, like SPECT, the different things they look for. He did say that in certain brain conditions such as attention deficit disorder and schizophrenia, prefrontal cortex activity decreases in response to an intellectual challenge. So, when you think in terms of dog behavior, animal behavior in general, dogs barking, reacting, lunging towards things, towards people, towards other dogs, being ready to attack, the fear that it's expressed in such extreme ways when they feel threatened or they feel that their turf is being compromised or threatened by a person or another dog or another animal. They become monsters. That's kind of what happens when our limbic system is uncontrolled, unregulated, not disciplined or domesticated, if you if you want to use that terminology, that imagery. So we do have to domesticate the limbic system, one of the older brains. I'm not saying we have to totally deny all our emotions. Emotions can be linked to both imagination and the soul, linking the brain and mind to the soul and the heart. Now, if the prefrontal cortex is damaged or overactive, you're going to have a sick king or queen or executor or CEO or the boss of the brains, of all the five brains. Well, the five brains that Eamon talks about. So what are some problems with the prefrontal cortex, associated with the prefrontal cortex? Okay, short attention span for one, distractibility, lack of perseverance, lack of impulse control problems, hyperactivity, chronic lateness or poor time management, disorganization, procrastination, unavailability of emotions, misperceptions, which is a huge part of this presentation. So sometimes there might be a behavioral or a brain component to misperceiving what's real and what's not real. Although the way the reality and unreality is spoken of, or illusions versus reality is spoken of in a spiritual sense, and of course in Miracles sense, or a Vedantic sense, or a non-dual sense, has much more to do with perception of energy and matter and forms versus thoughts. But misperception, just wanted to throw it out there, has much to do with the frontal lobes. Poor judgments are associated with problems with the prefrontal cortex. Trouble learning from experiences, as we mentioned. Short-term memory problems, as we mentioned. And social and test anxiety. Well, then Eamon goes into talk about ADD, how to deal with it, how certain people he's worked with have dealt with it, distractibility, the just how crazy impulsivity can get. You know, having poor thought out decisions. So again, this all relates to thought. Brain functioning itself all has to do with thought and messages in the body that are sent to the body, sent from the senses or the sense organs to the brain, where thoughts are manufactured and feedback is given from the brain. Thoughts, energy and information, impulses. Thoughts are impulses. The disorganization, you see it in certain people. Some people are called scatterbrain geniuses, and you look at their workspace, it's a total mess. You know, they're working on all these projects at once, 10 different things at once, not being able to master one or finish one. And as I said that, I just looked down, and Eamon says these people start many projects but finish few. And I'm finally mastering that in my life here at almost 33 years old. You know, that just goes to show you that you don't have the brain you're born with isn't the brain that you have to have for the rest of your life. Now, certain people who have brain damage or severe trauma, they may never regain certain functions or obtain or reach and develop certain stages or states of ability and abilities that somebody with a healthy brain might have. So it's important to make that distinction. People with ADD, such as myself, and I can speak from knowing and then seeing it in others when I worked in schools, unmanaged by medication or meditation, for instance, the energy and enthusiasm of people with ADD, they often are pushed by that energy to start many projects, but then they don't finish them because they come up with another idea, some seemingly great epiphany, and then that takes their attention. So something, when it's novel or new and exciting, they get attached to it, they put all their attention on it, they have to have it, they have to do it, they have to work on something, they have to express a thought and write it down, do something, work on this project, and then they seemingly abandon it. So the goal is just becoming more balanced, becoming aware, disciplining your brain through some of the techniques used in this book, Dr. Amen's book, Change Your Brain, Change Your Life, and also through some of the meditation interventions that we'll be speaking of, and some of which will be shared by Bishop Lee Allen Peterson. Now, there's many interesting pictures in here from SPECT imaging that show what an ADD-affected brain look like on and off of stimulant medications that help to control the underactivity, believe it or not. The underactivity that causes ADD. That's the reason a stimulant is used. Now, most people wouldn't really expect that to be true when they see ADHD, a hyperactive person. Although, well, he's not speaking of ADHD, so I don't quite know if that's the same. The case is the same with that. So attentional issues are a huge thing. Now, this gets back to what we talked about earlier with schizophrenia, fragmented thought, psychosis. Originally, earlier, when we talked about schizophrenia from a soul-centered psychiatric perspective, as well as from a spiritual revelation perspective, the spiritual elements involved in that schizophrenia revelation to Ida Mae Hammond that was shared in the book Pigs in the Parlor, I had wanted to share some studies that are being done, and the main point of what I had called the neurology of schizophrenia, based on some doctors' and some researchers' information, talked a lot about the corpus callosum, which is the bridge between the two hemispheres of the brain, and there was certain studies done on that showed some consistent results of people who were affected with schizophrenia. But Dr. Amen attributes markedly decreased prefrontal activity with multiple hotspots across the cortex in that prefrontal area with people with schizophrenia. So now, coming full circle, here talking about brain anatomy, just to tie in what we heard, what we shared, what I shared in the soul-centered approaches, the holistic-centered approaches, in the archetypal Jungian understanding of schizophrenic conditions with archetypal influences. But now there is brain abnormality evidence. And it goes back to the same thing. The prefrontal cortex, as was mentioned with Joseph Chilton Pierce, about abnormalities in that area and how it really can be a source of separation in which may manifest evil tendencies, violent tendencies, things considered to be severely antisocial. Now, there's a misunderstanding about what antisocial means. People think people who don't like to communicate with others and hate to be in groups in public, they think that's being antisocial. No, that's being asocial. Being antisocial means you don't give a care what you do to anyone. It's basically like not having a conscience, doing things very, very, very disturbing things and not thinking twice about it. But under psychotic disorders, here talking about again the prefrontal cortex, prefrontal activity or underactivity. Amen says that psychotic disorders such as schizophrenia affect a person's ability to distinguish reality from fantasy. I think we've established that already. These disorders are complex and involve several brain areas. So, building on what I just said a few minutes ago, and even if we referred back to that neurology of schizophrenia and the findings, we would find abnormalities in other parts of the brain. But specifically, we have the imaging, we have the evidence here, not just from some inconclusive tests, but this is very conclusive. The stuff that Dr. Amen has produced, and here are some images in the book. So I encourage you to get the book, Change Your Brain, Change Your Life. And he says, like we tried to define earlier, schizophrenia is a chronic, long-standing disorder characterized by delusions, hallucinations, and distorted thinking. Now, there's a form of what I would say is medical-based, organic-based schizophrenic disorder or pathology, psychopathology. But I believe there's the spiritual element as well, as was revealed in Pigs in the Parlor. And it has nothing to do with being a sinner. It just has everything to do with energy, information. It has to do with conditioning, certain conditioning, predispositions to rejection, and bitterness, and rebellion, and distortion, and disturbance, distress, disturbances in personality development. And I said earlier, at the beginning of the whole course, that this world is an hallucination. Does that make us all schizophrenic? Only to the extent that we can't tell reality from unreality, because the movie that we're projecting out into the space that is out there, upon which our images go onto the screen that's out there in space, we think that the subjective, relative perceptions we're having are the be-all, end-all. That our story is the big story. And many of us are trapped in that. We all get trapped in that. And that's the existence of being a dog. You're reacting to the impressions you put out into the world. You're reacting to the things that happen around you. You perceive attack. Dogs perceive or have the notion that they're being attacked, that their turf is being attacked when they see something unfamiliar, when they see something they're unsure of, when they see another dog. Course in Miracles talks about when you see a brother or sister in their body, then you're in their body alone is another body. Then you're acting out of fear. And that's a dog-like behavior, an animal-like behavior. So again, with schizophrenia, you're dealing with distorted thinking. So for those with the extremes of organic-based schizophrenia, prefrontal lobe abnormality, it's a thought disorder. And that is an extreme form of schizophrenia. And what the rest of us suffer from is an abstraction or symbolic nature or symbolic form of that. It's more like mass schizophrenia, or the word we've used or will be using, mass hypnosis. Dreaming, half asleep, not knowing where our eternal reference point is, which is the Godhead. So again, get the book. Get the book, Change Your Brain, Change Your Life. You'll see what these brain images look like under SPECT imaging. But we all hear voices and we all hear chatter. It's amplified tremendously for the schizophrenic or schizoaffective. And as with previous Dr. Amen material, we're going to have prescriptions from him later. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to move on. We're going to look at dogs of worry, addictive dogs, and dogs that obsess. We're going to look at the cingulate system, that anatomy, both that produces the good and the evil.